When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I didn't want her to see my sadness, my hurt, my confusion. I stood there holding a cup of tea and I smiled. I whispered to myself, "It's okay, it's okay. Maybe she doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I have lived in this house for 35 years. I raised my son here. I cooked his meals, washed his clothes, wiped his tears, celebrated his small victories, and soothed his fears. I watched him grow from a little boy into a young man full of dreams and laughter. And now, he has a life I am no longer part of, or so it feels. I remember when he was small. He used to run into my arms with a bright smile, shouting, "Ma, Ma," as if the world could not exist without our small, perfect moments together. Those calls, that laughter, it filled every corner of this house. Every morning, every evening, I would hear his voice and my heart would feel full. But life changes, slowly. One day, that little boy becomes a man. One day, a wife enters the picture. One day, a home is shared, and your voice begins to feel like it echoes too softly. When she told me to leave, I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't say anything sharp or loud. I simply smiled. My heart was heavy, yes, but I had learned that anger solves nothing. That sadness, when handled gently, can teach more than words ever can. I took a sip of tea. The warmth spread slowly through my hands. The room felt quiet, like it had absorbed all my whispers and left nothing behind. I remembered the day he first called me mother instead of ma. It had been subtle at first, a word here, a pause there, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, that little word that had carried love and closeness became formal. He used to call me Ma. Now it's just mother. And I realized in that quiet moment that love does not always vanish. Sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it drifts softly, quietly, without anyone noticing. I grew up in a small town, in a house that smelled of fresh bread and warm earth. My parents taught me kindness, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from taking care of others. I learned to love through small gestures, a shared meal, a gentle word, a hand held in silence. When I married, I carried those lessons with me. My husband and I built a life together, full of ordinary days that felt extraordinary because they were ours. The walls of our house absorbed laughter, arguments, tears, and quiet evenings of reading together. Every corner held a memory. Every chair held a story. Then came my son. From the moment he was born, I felt a depth of love I had never known. Holding him, I whispered promises I could not keep fully, promises that I would be there, always, no matter what. I watched him crawl, walk, fall, and rise again. I held his scraped knees, kissed his fevered forehead, and listened to every word he said, no matter how small. He had a curious mind and a gentle heart. Even as a boy, he cared deeply about the feelings of others. He remembered birthdays, smiled at strangers, and often hugged me when he thought no one was looking. Those moments, simple and fleeting, built a bond that I thought nothing could break. Our family was not perfect. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and moments of silence that stretched longer than comfortable. But there was also laughter, love, and countless days of togetherness. I remember one afternoon when he was about 8. He came running into the kitchen, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "Ma, look what I drew." I smiled, wiped my hands on my apron, and bent down to see. It was a scribbled house, a tree, and a small stick figure holding another stick figure's hand. "Is that me and you?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Yes, you and me, always together." I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Always, my love, always." Those days passed quickly: school, homework, friends, sports. And slowly he began to grow, to stretch, to explore the world outside our small home. I cheered quietly from the sidelines. I let him go, even when my heart ached. I learned, slowly, that love sometimes means letting go. He became a teenager, then a young adult. I watched him make mistakes and recover. I offered advice when he asked, guidance when he sought it, and space when he needed it. The balance between caring and stepping back was delicate, but I tried my best. And then came the day he told me he had met someone. His voice was quiet, almost shy. "Ma, I met someone." I felt a warmth fill my chest. A smile broke across my face. "Oh, tell me about her." "She's kind, she's smart. I think you'll like her." I did. She was polite, gentle, respectful. She smiled at me, held my hand, and carried herself with a quiet confidence. I wanted to welcome her. I wanted to hold her as part of the family I had raised. But slowly, things began to shift. Small things at first. Calls returned late, messages answered briefly, visits shortened. I reminded myself, life changes, a new family forms. Children grow, and the rhythm of love changes with them. I adjusted. I learned to be quiet when he was busy, to offer space instead of proximity. I told myself every day, he still loves me, he still needs me, he's just learning a new life. Yet, sometimes in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the light fell softly across the floor, I would hear the absence of his laughter. I would feel the weight of unreturned calls, unanswered texts, and the faint echo of a word I had once cherished: "Ma." I realized then that love is patient, but patience is not effortless. Every day it asks us to hope without expectation, to wait without resentment, to continue giving when the world seems to move past us. At first, it was the small things: a text that went unanswered for hours, a missed call, a quick visit that lasted barely 15 minutes. I told myself, he's busy, he's building his life, this is normal. But deep inside, a quiet worry began to grow. I remember the first time I noticed it. He had come home one evening, his face bright, smiling. But when I went to hug him, he stiffened slightly. "Hi, Ma," he said, and it felt different, polite, distant. The warmth of his childhood voice was gone. "Hello, my love," I said softly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "How was your day?" "Fine," he replied, already glancing at his phone. Then he excused himself, leaving me standing in the hallway, holding the faint scent of his cologne and feeling the first sting of unfamiliar distance. I tried to push it aside. I told myself that he was growing up, that men sometimes act differently with their mothers once they have their own lives. But the pattern continued. Small, subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Dinner times changed first. Before, we would sit together, laughing, talking about school, friends, small dreams. Now, he barely glanced at me. He ate quickly, focusing on his phone or his wife's conversation. I tried to join in, asking questions about his day, sharing little stories from mine, but the pauses between his words grew longer. His smiles felt rehearsed. His laughter sounded distant. One evening, I tried to join their conversation in the living room. I mentioned a simple story about a neighbor who had helped me with groceries. "Ma, that's nice," he said, distractedly, scrolling through his phone. His wife looked at me with a polite smile, but I could feel the tension in her eyes, the slight tightness in her jaw. I realized then that I had become invisible, not hated, not disliked, simply unnoticed. I tried not to feel hurt. I told myself every day, it's just a phase. They're adjusting to life together. They still love you. But love does not always announce itself in bold declarations. Sometimes it hides in the quiet corners, in the gestures we cannot force, in the laughter that comes only when it feels natural. And when it is missing, we feel it sharply. Another small sign appeared when I went to prepare his favorite tea one morning. I entered the kitchen, carrying the kettle, and found him already there. "Ma, you don't need to make tea today. We've got some already." I nodded, trying to mask the sting of disappointment. Of course, I thought. Why would he need me now? He's grown. He has his own routines. But then the comments started. Casual, harmless-seeming remarks that felt like tiny pricks to the heart. "Mother, do we have to talk about this again?" "Ma, don't worry about it." The word "ma" was slipping further and further away, replaced with a polite, distant "mother." And with each word, I felt a quiet ache, the kind that doesn't shout, but whispers in your chest, persistent and slow. I began noticing other signs, too. Invitations I wasn't included in. Family events I only heard about afterward. My calls were sometimes returned, sometimes ignored. And when he did speak, the tone was measured, cautious, almost apologetic. It felt as though our shared past, the laughter, the bedtime stories, the comfort of knowing each other completely, was slowly fading into something fragile, delicate, easily broken. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the garden, watching him play with our dog, a small smile on his face. He laughed freely, the way he used to with me. And I thought, this is still him. He hasn't changed completely. There is still hope. But then he looked up, saw me, and smiled politely. Not the way he used to, not the way his eyes sparkled when he called my name joyfully. The smile was kind, yes, but formal. He waved briefly, then returned to his game. I remember whispering to myself, almost inaudibly, "I miss you, my boy." Small misunderstandings began to surface, too. One evening, I overheard a conversation that made my heart tighten. "Mom, she's everywhere," I heard her whisper to my son. "Sometimes it feels like we can't have a moment alone." He replied softly, almost reluctantly, "I know, I know." I did not confront them. I did not argue. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat quietly. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the ache of being seen as unnecessary. I loved him, yes, but I also realized that love alone does not protect us from feeling replaced. Then came the small exclusions from conversations. The decisions I used to be part of, holiday plans, family purchases, visits to relatives, were now made without asking me. I felt my presence shrinking, slowly, like a shadow fading in the evening light. One morning, I tried to speak about a family matter, gently, cautiously, as if testing the waters. "I thought maybe we could visit Auntie Salma this weekend," I said softly. He looked up from his laptop, hesitated, and said, "I'll check with her. We'll see." The pause that followed was heavy, loaded. I felt it as a quiet refusal. Not a harsh no, not an argument, just absence. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I smiled, nodded, and went to the kitchen to make tea. As weeks passed, the quiet distance grew. I tried to fill it with small acts of care. I washed dishes after their meals, tidied the living room, left little notes on the table. Yet it often felt like my gestures were overlooked, unappreciated, or simply unseen. I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior toward me. Small dismissals, gentle corrections, a tone of voice that implied patience but not intimacy. And I realized, painfully, that the bond I had cherished, built over years, strengthened by shared memories, was changing. I asked myself, is this my fault? Did I do something wrong? I scoured my memories, replayed conversations, examined my actions. But I found nothing substantial, only the truth. Life was moving forward, and I was struggling to keep pace. And then came the day that made everything painfully real. I had prepared a simple breakfast, his favorite, toast with jam, just the way he liked it. I placed it on the table and waited. "Ma, you don't need to do this," he said quietly. "I just thought you might like it," I replied, trying to keep my voice light, gentle. He shook his head, almost apologetically. "It's okay, really." His wife looked at me and smiled, politely, but there was a firmness in her eyes, a silent boundary, a quiet declaration that some spaces were no longer mine to occupy freely. I felt my heart shrink a little that morning, realizing how much had shifted. The warmth, the closeness, the shared life I had known. It was still there, yes, but it was layered now, complicated by new relationships, new priorities, new boundaries. Even simple touches, the hug I offered, the hand I reached out to hold, were sometimes met with hesitation. And every hesitation whispered the same message: you are still loved, but differently. You are no longer central. I tried to talk to him once, gently, carefully. Do you do you feel distant from me?" I asked, my voice soft, almost trembling. He paused, looked at me, and said, "Ma, I don't mean to. I just have a lot going on." "I understand," I whispered. I miss you sometimes." And he nodded, quietly, politely, and the conversation ended. But the distance lingered. It wrapped around our home like a slow fog, quiet, invisible, yet undeniable. I began to realize that love does not always vanish suddenly. Sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it recedes slowly, leaving you wondering when the last spark faded. And sometimes it is not the person you love who changes, but the space around you. And that, I realized with a quiet ache, is the hardest kind of loss. When you are not unloved, but unnoticed. When you were not rejected, but slowly replaced. When the person you held closest to your heart still exists in your life, but in a form you can no longer recognize. It was a rainy evening when everything finally felt different. I had been sitting by the window, watching the drops run down the glass, each streak like a memory fading, each patter a quiet echo of what once was. I was making tea, my hands moving almost automatically, when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to see my son and his wife, both looking tense, serious. There was something in the way they stood, the way their eyes flickered. Not angry, not upset, but distant. That same distance I had felt creeping in for months now, heavier, almost tangible. "Ma, can we talk?" my son said softly, stepping inside. I nodded, setting the kettle aside. "Of course, come in. What's the matter?" They sat down in the living room, and I noticed my hands trembling slightly. I didn't understand yet, not fully. I only knew that something was coming, something I could feel in the air between us. His wife spoke first. We need some space, Ma." I froze. Space? I nodded slowly, forcing a calm smile. "I see. Space. I understand." "No, it's not like that," my son said, his voice quieter than usual, hesitant. "It's just things are different now. We have our own life, our home. I I don't want to hurt you, but..." His words trailed off, leaving a weight in the room, heavy and unyielding. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I see," I whispered, more to myself than to them. I I understand." I could feel the tears threatening, but I didn't let them fall. I sat there, small and quiet, listening as they explained. They spoke of boundaries, of space, of independence. They spoke gently, as though trying not to hurt me, but their words pierced deeper than any harsh tone ever could. You have your own life, Ma, his wife said softly. We need to live ours. I nodded again, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to argue, to beg them to stay close, to let me be part of their life as I always had been. But something inside me stopped. I realized then that arguing would not bring back the closeness, that love sometimes doesn't fight to remain. It simply transforms, and sometimes, painfully, you are left behind. I looked at my son, at the man he had become. He was the same boy I had held as a baby, watched as he learned to walk, cheered as he grew. But now he was distant, polite, careful, measured. And I realized with a sharp ache that the child who had called me Ma with pure joy no longer existed in the same way. I understand, I said again, my voice soft, calm. I want you to be happy. I want you to have your life. He reached for my hand briefly, almost apologetically. We love you, Ma. We really do. But it's different now. I nodded, holding his hand for a moment before letting it go. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply felt the weight of absence settle in my chest, a quiet, relentless ache. That night, I sat alone in my room, the rain tapping against the window like soft, sorrowful music. I replayed the conversation in my mind over and over. I thought about the years of closeness, the laughter, the bedtime stories, the hugs and kisses, and I realized, painfully, that all of it had not disappeared. It had just changed. The next days were even harder. Their boundaries became more defined. I wasn't included in decisions, plans, small daily routines. I found myself standing at the edge of my own family life, watching it continue without me. One afternoon, I saw something that could deeper than words ever could. My son was laughing, genuinely, with his friends. His wife was beside him, smiling, chatting, planning things together. And I realized that in this world, there was no place for me anymore, not the same place. I remember sitting quietly on the porch, my hands folded in my lap, watching them through the glass. I wanted to call him, to ask for just a few moments, to remind him that I existed. But I didn't. I let them be, because I knew that pressing would only push them further away. Then came the moment that truly broke me, though I did not let it show. My son had called me, as he sometimes did, to tell me about something small, a new recipe, a minor event at work. But the way he spoke, the distance in his voice, the careful politeness, it was different. There was no warmth, no spontaneous laughter, no joy, only measured words. Ma, just so you know, we're planning a little trip this weekend, he said. It's just us. I nodded quietly, my voice steady. I see. I hope you enjoy it. He paused. Thanks, Ma. And then in that brief pause, I realized something. I had become an observer in my own son's life. I could watch, care, love, but my presence was no longer central. I was not unwelcome, but I was no longer needed. The following days blurred into a quiet ache. I tried to fill my time with chores, reading, gardening, small errands, but the emptiness lingered, a soft, persistent whisper in the corners of my heart. One evening, I decided to leave a letter on his bedside table. Simple words, carefully chosen. I love you. I always will. And I want you to be happy, even if that means I must step back. I will always be here, quietly, for you. I didn't expect a response. I didn't want one. I only wanted him to know that my love had not changed, even if the closeness had. But that night, I overheard them talking. We need to tell her, his wife said softly. Tell her what? He asked. That things can't be the same, not the way they were. We need to create boundaries, clearly. I sat quietly, listening from the other room, my hands clasped together. My heart felt heavy, yet strangely resolute. I realized then that life often forces us into moments we are not ready for, moments where love and closeness must be redefined. And sometimes the hardest part is accepting that the person you love is no longer the same place in your life as before. I cried that night, quietly, alone, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in deep, aching sorrow. Tears that were not about loss of love, but loss of place, loss of the central role I had always played in his life. Days passed, and the reality settled in. The boundaries were established. My presence was gentle, careful, measured. I could visit, call, care, but the spontaneous warmth, the closeness of old days was gone. And I realized that nothing could bring it back. Not force, not words, not tears, only acceptance. And yet, even in the midst of heartbreak, there was clarity. I loved him still. I always would. But love, I realized, was not possession. It was letting go, in small ways, of the closeness we once had. It was stepping back, quietly, and hoping that the people you love will carry you in their hearts, even if not beside them in life. I began to write again, notes, letters, small thoughts, not for them to read necessarily, but for myself, to remind me that my love was not diminished, that my place in the world, though changed, still existed, that I could still care, still watch, still cherish, without demanding to be central. It was painful. It was lonely. It was the hardest lesson I had ever faced. But it was real. And for the first time, I realized that true love sometimes requires letting go of the past, of expectations, of the way things were. It requires facing the quiet truth that people change, lives change, and the heart must find strength not in clinging, but in accepting. The days that followed were quiet, almost painfully so. The house no longer felt like a shared space full of laughter, chatter, and warmth. Instead, it felt like a museum of memories, each room holding echoes of moments that had once been alive. I moved carefully through it, touching familiar surfaces, smelling the faint scent of spices in the kitchen, seeing the little marks on the walls where my son had once drawn. Every small thing reminded me of what had been and what was no longer. I began to take long walks in the mornings, even when it was cold or raining. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps match the rhythm of my thoughts. At first, every step felt heavy, weighed down by the emptiness I carried. But gradually, I noticed something. The world outside was still moving. The trees swayed with the wind, birds sang softly in the distance, the sun shone gently on puddles left by the rain. Life continued, and somehow I realized that I could continue too, even if my role had changed. I started small, cooking for myself, reading quietly in the afternoons, sitting on the porch and watching the world go by. I found solace in these tiny rituals, these moments that reminded me that I still had a place in life, even if it was not the one I had once imagined. And then, slowly, I began to reconnect with memories, with letters, with old photographs. I opened albums that I hadn't looked at in years. I saw my son's baby pictures, the first steps, first words, birthdays, holidays. I smiled through tears, remembering the love that had always been there. I realized then that love doesn't disappear, even when closeness does. It simply changes form. I also began to reach out to friends, neighbors, even distant relatives. At first, I hesitated. I worried that I might feel empty again, that others would not understand. But slowly, conversations began to fill the quiet spaces in my days. Stories were shared, laughter returned, soft and gentle, but genuine. It was different from the laughter I had known with my son, but it was still a gift. One afternoon, I received a small, unexpected note from my son. It was brief, written in careful handwriting. "Ma, I was thinking of you today. Hope you had a good morning. Love, always." I held the note close to my heart. It wasn't a promise of old closeness. It wasn't an invitation to step back into the past. But it was a reminder that love remained, quietly, even when lives had shifted. I began to understand something important. Relationships, like life, are never static. They change, evolve, and sometimes they move in ways we cannot control. But that doesn't mean they disappear. My love for my son did not vanish. It simply needed a new shape, a quieter presence, a patience I had not known I possessed. I also learned the power of forgiveness, not only for him, but for myself. For the times I had wished for things to stay the same, for the moments I had felt hurt or left out, for the longing that had weighed so heavily on my heart. I forgave myself for feeling sad, for missing what was gone, for struggling to accept the new reality. And in that forgiveness, I felt a small, steady light return. There were moments that still hurt. Holidays were harder. Birthdays carried a subtle ache. I sometimes caught myself reaching for the phone to call, to speak, to hear that familiar voice. And then I would pause, remember the boundaries that had been set, and breathe. The pain did not vanish, but it softened, became a quiet companion rather than a sharp blade. I also found joy in small gestures. A call from a neighbor, the bloom of flowers in the garden, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. These moments reminded me that life is layered, full of subtle beauty, even when sadness lingers. I began to notice the tiny gifts that each day offered, and in them I found a measure of peace. One evening I sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. I thought of my son and his wife, of the new life they were building. I wished them happiness, a life full of laughter and love. I realized that wishing for them to be happy did not mean I had lost my own. Happiness. It meant that my love had transformed, and in that transformation, there was room for both their joy and mine. I also began to write letters, not to send, but to hold. Letters to my son, to my younger self, to the years that had passed. Words flowed slowly, carefully, full of emotion. I poured out longing, gratitude, hope, and acceptance. Each letter became a small step toward healing, a reminder that my heart could hold many things at once: sorrow, love, and resilience. There were days when I felt fragile, when a simple memory or a passing thought would bring tears, but I learned to let them fall and then let them go. Tears became not a sign of weakness, but a release, a gentle way to honor my feelings without being consumed by them. Over time, I noticed a subtle change. The quiet in the house no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space, space for reflection, for growth, for gentle love that did not demand, that did not cling. I could love my son and his wife without needing to be the center of their lives. I could be present in a different way, soft, steady, unwavering, even from a distance. I began to share my stories with others, quietly. Friends who had faced similar changes in family life, neighbors who had grown apart from children or siblings, even strangers who listened patiently. Sharing became a balm, a way to remind myself that my experiences were part of the larger human story, that pain, love, and acceptance are threads that connect us all. And slowly, I began to see the beauty in change, in the shifting of relationships, in the ebb and flow of closeness, in the delicate balance between presence and absence. I realized that love is not always loud, not always visible, not always near. Sometimes love is a quiet heartbeat, felt in small gestures, in patience, in the courage to step back and let those we care for grow. One day, my son visited. There was no tension, no expectation, only presence. We sat together, quietly, drinking tea. He spoke about work, about small moments in his life, about things he thought I would find interesting. And I listened, truly listened, without wishing for the past, without yearning for what had been. In that moment, I realized something profound. Love had not disappeared. It had simply taken a new form, a form that was quieter, more patient, and infinitely more resilient. A love that could endure distance, change, and time. I felt gratitude then, gratitude for the years we had shared, for the lessons I had learned, for the capacity of my heart to hold both sorrow and joy. I understood, finally, that my role in life, though different, was still meaningful. That I could love deeply without needing to control, without needing to cling, without needing to demand. And in that understanding, I found peace. The house felt alive again, not in the way it had been, but in a gentler, steadier way. I could walk through the rooms, touch familiar surfaces, and remember without pain. I could speak of the past without longing, and of the future without fear. I had learned that the heart is resilient, that love is not possession, and that the quiet spaces in life can hold profound beauty. I began to notice the small joys every day, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the laughter of children playing outside, the soft hum of life continuing. And I realized that I was still part of it, still present, still capable of love, still capable of hope. And in that hope, I found the courage to let go completely, not of my son, not of the love I felt, but of the idea that life must remain the same. I embraced change. I embraced the quiet. I embraced the gentle truth that love, when patient and enduring, can survive anything, even distance, even absence, even the shifting sands of time. I understood, at last, that love is not measured by proximity or possession. It is measured by the strength of the heart, the patience of the soul, and the courage to continue caring, even when the world changes. And so I moved forward, slowly, gently, with a heart full of quiet love, a mind full of reflection, and a soul that had learned resilience. I was still a mother, always, but I had also learned to be more than that, an observer, a supporter, a quiet presence. And in that transformation, I found a beauty I had never known. The turning point had been painful. It had been quiet, yet immense. But it had also been necessary. And in its wake, I discovered a truth that I would carry forever. Love endures, even when it changes, even when it hurts, even when it seems distant. Love, in its truest form, is eternal, patient, and unwavering. As the days passed, life settled into a quiet rhythm. The house, once heavy with silence, now felt like a place of gentle memories. I would often sit by the window, watching the world outside, feeling the soft breeze on my face, listening to the distant laughter of children playing. I realized then that life has a way of moving forward, even when we are not ready, and sometimes we need to let it. I learned to see love differently, not as something that always requires presence or closeness, but as a feeling that grows quietly, in patience, in understanding, and in acceptance. My heart no longer ached with longing every time I thought of my son. Instead, it carried a quiet warmth, a knowledge that love can exist even from afar. There were mornings when I would make tea and look at the photographs on the wall. I would smile softly at the images of my son as a child, at the birthdays and holidays, at the little moments frozen in time. And I would whisper to myself, "You were always loved, and you are still loved." That thought became a gentle mantra, a reminder that connection does not always need words or touch to exist. Sometimes I would write letters to my son, even though I didn't send them. I would tell him about my days, my small joys, and my quiet thoughts. I wrote about the garden blooming, rain tapping on the windows, the books I was reading, the walks I took alone. And I felt a strange comfort in writing, as if my love and care could still reach him even without a reply. I also began to notice the small gifts life offered every day. A neighbor's smile, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of birds in the morning. I discovered that joy does not always arrive with grand gestures. It often lives in the quiet, unnoticed moments that fill our days with meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I felt a deep sense of peace. I thought of all the pain, the misunderstandings, the distance, and I realized that I had grown. I had learned patience, endurance, and the ability to love without expectation. And in that realization, I found a profound strength I had not known before. I understood that life does not always give us the story we imagined. Sometimes it gives us a different story, one that asks us to adapt, to accept, and to find love in new forms. And sometimes that story teaches us the most important lessons, that love is not possession, that forgiveness is freedom, and that patience can heal the deepest wounds. I thought of my son and his life, his happiness, and I smiled. I no longer felt sadness mixed with longing. I felt pride, gratitude, and a quiet hope. I knew that even if our paths were not as intertwined as before, our bond remained, invisible but unbroken, like a gentle thread connecting our hearts. And so I continue my days with a calm heart. I love freely, quietly, and without expectation. I cherish memories without clinging to them. I embrace change, understanding that it is a part of life. And I carry hope, knowing that love endures in ways we sometimes cannot see. Perhaps the greatest lesson I have learned is this: life may change, relationships may shift, and roles may transform, but love in its purest form does not fade. It adapts, it persists, and it remains patient, resilient, and eternal. As I sit quietly now, watching the world move gently around me, I know this is enough. Love is enough. Presence is enough. Hope is enough. And I am enough just as I am, strong, patient, and full of quiet love that will carry me forward, always. And in that quiet realization, I smile.